Satan's fall. If chapter 14 of the book of Isaiah describes the development and expression of Satan's mental state, culminating in his launching of a rebellion against God, Ezekiel chapter 28 describes the process of putting his arrogant plan into practice, albeit in largely reverse order, tracing the matter backward at first from the result to the cause, verses 15 through 17, before more fully explicating the charge against Satan in verse 18. It will be helpful to translate and briefly analyze these verses in their order of occurrence before moving on to a full consideration of Satan's coup d'etat, his revolutionary platform, and the scriptural names given to him which mark out his character for all to see, branding him as the deceiver and opponent of the Lord God Almighty he truly is. Your heart became haughty because of your beauty, and so you destroyed your wisdom on account of your splendor. So I cast you to the earth, and I made a spectacle of you before kings. Ezekiel 28:17. Arrogant pride, attributed specifically to Satan's high esteem for his own appearance, is at the root of the thought pattern whose course we saw Isaiah chronicle. Persistent and obsessive preoccupation with his own loveliness over time had a corrupting influence upon Satan's whole mental attitude, neutralizing, then effectively destroying his conscience, his character, and his wholesome fear of God. The judgments described in the second half of the verse are perfectively future. That is, it is a fate so certain, since it has been decreed by God, that it is described as already having happened. The first half of the judgment, being cast to earth, will be carried out during the second half of the tribulation, the so-called Great Tribulation, Revelation 12:7 through 13. The second half of the prophecy, becoming a spectacle before kings, refers to Satan's final disposition into the lake of fire, Revelation 20:10. Satan destroyed the wisdom God had given him, and ungratefully rebelled against God. Therefore God will destroy him. He who would be king shall be humbled before God's appointed royalty by the King of Kings. In your extensive conspiring, you were filled with wickedness, and you sinned. So I cast you from the mountain of God as one profaned, and I blotted out your memory from among the stones of fire, O covering cherub. Ezekiel 28:16. Satan's conspiracy is first explicitly mentioned here, that is, his active attempt to carry out his plan of the 5 I wills. The Hebrew word Rachel, translated here as conspiring, has the twofold meaning of repetitive motion, trading or trafficking, and of slandering. In the context of Satan's activities, it fits our notion of conspiracy quite well. Once arrogance had led to perverted thinking, verse 17, these mental attitude sins blossomed into the overt activity of canvassing his fellow angels for support, slandering God in the process, an activity characterized by Ezekiel as wickedness. Satan was attempting to besmirch God's reputation to gain adherents and further his own goals, but God here declares another fitting judgment on Satan, the future obliteration of any remembrance of him, let alone his reputation, and his physical expulsion from the place he fain would occupy as ruler of the universe. In all your ways you were perfect from the day of your creation until unrighteousness was found in you. Ezekiel 28:15. In the abundance of your iniquity, in the unrighteousness of your conspiring, you profaned the sacred places entrusted to you. So I made fire come out of your midst which devoured you, and I made you like the dust of the earth in the eyes of all who beheld you. Ezekiel 28:18. These 2 verses, one at the head of this section, and the other at the end of it, both treat Satan's sin and fall in summary form. Verse 15 takes a subjective viewpoint. Satan was made perfect. God is not to blame for his rejection of God. Nevertheless, by his own actions he became unrighteous, that is, unqualified for eternal contact and residence with God because of sin. Verse 18 sums up from an objective viewpoint. Satan's conduct is described as iniquity. Hebrew avon, a strong word for egregious and presumptuous sin and the guilt it incurs. This activity is further described as a lack of righteousness here too, but the word avil is now applied not to Satan himself, as in verse 15, but to his deeds, namely, his conspiratorial actions. Once again, the future judgment is described as already having occurred, its eventuality being so certain as to be without doubt. Satan will actually be cast into the lake of fire following Christ's millennial reign, Revelation 20:10. Entrusted with the guardianship of the innermost shrines of the Lord, Satan betrayed and polluted his trust. Therefore, God has decreed that Satan himself shall be desecrated, his pollution incinerated in eternal fire. Satan's coup d'état. As would-be usurper of God's throne, Satan found himself in a delicate position. When he conceived his nefarious ambition, he was on his own. Even in his unparalleled arrogance, he must have realized that he would need help if we're to be successful in his attempt to dethrone the Lord of the universe. Satan did have some advantages, however. As the preeminent and highest-ranking angelic creature, not to mention the most impressive, Satan had considerable influence and authority over the other angels. None would be likely to rebel from the Lord instantaneously on Satan's say-so, but with proper preparation, it might be possible to sway some of his fellows. Satan's plan was not to overthrow God by force, for such a course of action was a complete impossibility, as even Satan with his inflated sense of self saw clearly enough, but rather to effect a coup d'état. By winning over the allegiance of the angels, Satan thought to present God with a fait accompli which he would be powerless to reverse. For if the angels were to choose Satan over God, the devil seems to have felt secure that this fact in itself would protect him from divine retribution. This conclusion about Satan's thinking and strategy is, in fact, necessary, unless, of course, we are to assume that the devil really felt he could overpower God with a band of rebellious angels, and surely the wiles that the preeminent of all of God's creatures has demonstrated during our own human phase of history show clearly enough that Satan was smarter than that. But why should Satan feel secure from the wrath of an omnipotent God against whom he planned to rebel, simply because of some success on his part in seducing other angelic creatures into following his lead? The answer to this difficult question lies in Satan's false perception of God's character. Satan realized, of course, that God had the power to crush him and his rebellion instantly and effortlessly. What Satan was counting on, however, was not that he would be able to oppose the omnipotence of God, but that God would be forced by his own perfect integrity to refrain from annihilating Satan and his followers. Even as the devil claims today that a truly loving God cannot punish his own creatures and still be consistent with his love, so in eternity past Satan outrageously staked the success of his traitorous ploy on God's own character. The universe at that time, populated as it was with its numerous angelic inhabitants, was a perfect, harmonious whole. Could God really rend its fabric so drastically and unalterably by condemning Satan to destruction, along with the plethora of angels he was absolutely certain he could convince to follow him? Satan must have reasoned that without some opportunity for reconciliation, and without some means of replacing what would be lost, and thus restoring the perfect whole, his condemnation would be inconceivable, because it would be completely inconsistent with the loving, fair, perfect God he knew. But neither of these two necessities would be possible. Reconciliation, and therefore restoration, would be impossible because 1. There would be no way to expiate treason against God, taken as it would be in complete knowledge and understanding of the implications, and 2. By their very nature, as we have seen, the angels who would choose for Satan would do so unalterably once and for all. Replacement also seemed to be an impossible option, inasmuch as angelic kind, as important and meaningful to God as every one of us believers are, witness the memorial stones of fire, was created corporately and simultaneously. It would seem to have been inconsistent with God's character to begin a new round of partial creation to patch up and repair the damage done by the devil. No action God could take in response to the planned rebellion, at least as Satan summed up the situation, would redound to his glory. In the devil's reasoning, therefore, God would find himself boxed in by the insurrection he was planning, and would be forced by his own perfection to leave Satan be as the universe's new de facto sovereign.